Global Governance Futures is brought to you from the Global Governance Institute at University College London. This is a podcast about the challenges facing humanity and possible global responses. How does the world hang together? What has gone wrong? And what has global governance got to do with it? To learn more, please visit ucl.ac.uk/global-governance.
Here at UCL's Global Governance Institute, we analyse challenges across the political landscape by thinking in terms of complex adaptive systems. An essay by Bonnitta Roy, titled Complex Potential States, makes a compelling case for why we need to think more creatively about complexity. Naturally, we thought she'd be a great fit for the podcast. Our discussion focuses on how the sense of crisis that so often looms over public debate is as much to do with how we perceive the world as it is to do with what goes on within it. We're living through a period of substantial change, but traditional linear and causal ways of thinking are maybe not so well suited to making sense of this. So in this eclectic episode, we consider the limits of consciousness and new ways of thinking about global challenges. This involves traversing humankind's relationship with nature, complexity, imagination, and much, much more.
And so I think the imagination is essential, but it has to partner with the real world. And so there's a lot of people who are really smart, and they're doing like synaptic integration of a lot of theories. And this is useful for people like me, but I don't think you can solve the problem there. It's more of a collaboration. You need people then who are trying to solve problems in the real world.
This is Imperfect Utopias or Bust, Global Governance Futures. Bonnitta Roy is a teacher and an author. Her work focuses on breaking away from limiting patterns of thought. This can be found in her master's course in consciousness studies and transpersonal psychology at the Graduate Institute. Equally, the Alderlore Insight Centre, where individuals go to develop their metacognitive skills. We spoke to her in January 2024.
Firstly, thanks for speaking and coming to chat to us. It's very exciting. I found it really fascinating reading through your work recently. It sort of acted as my entry into metamodernity. So that's been a lot of fun, definitely. Based off of all of that, I would say I get the impression that we are living through a period of like immense change. And the course that we do, the Global Governance and Ethics MSc, we look at this immense change. In particular, we look at the sort of different challenges that crop up in certain domains across international relations, like maybe tech or security, health, the climate, and so on and so forth. But one of the really interesting takeaways that I get from your work is that when we think about crisis, it's not just about what's happening in the world around us, but also our capacity to make sense of all of these things. So I guess what I mean is like the current way that we think, this way of thinking that's maybe built up throughout modernity is very linear, very causal. It's maybe in some way failing to keep up with growing global complexities. And I think in the essay, Complex Potential States, which I think we're going to start off by talking about, you address this inability when talking about complex adaptive systems thinking, some of its limitations for making sense of the world, in particular, this idea that it can sort of rob us of our agency and create like a sort of crisis mode feedback thing that's sort of going on in our heads and also in the world around us. So I was wondering if you could begin by explaining that limitation, and then maybe we could go on to talk about the idea of complex potential states and how that way of thinking offers an alternative or an improvement and so forth.
Yeah, that's perfect. I'm going to back up just a little and then come right to complex potential states. So yeah, you're absolutely right. When I think about the pickle we're in, or if I hear Daniel Schmattenberger say, the problem is the way we think about our problems. And you can keep backing up and backing up and backing up in one way, and that is to try to derive what is called causal depth. What is, capitalism does this, and then this, it's driven by human nature, let's say, and you could either work that way, or some people say human people are good, but they're driven by the incentives of capitalism, and that's driven by colonialism. There's this one way to try to get the bigger picture, and that is to move toward causal depth. And you see a lot of smart people doing that. But I came to a point where I thought, this is not helpful, because one man's ceiling is another man's floor, and the whole thing gets very complex. And so I started to thinking that there's just the whole approach has what I call malware. And the malware runs very, very, very deep. So I started to try to look at the fundamental ways we frame both how we see reality and how we see the problems in terms of this persistent mental models that we bring to the question. And how deep could that go, right? So it's different. It's a different kind of zooming out or getting deep. And so, I wrote that chapter for the metamodern book called Time, Change, and Causality, and said that the ways we relate to time and change and causality, these are very, very, very deep metaphysics or frameworks. And that I thought we were in the kind of situation where that's the level that this thing had to change, right? So that this level of these deep mental models. So in terms of change, that's where the complex potential states theory came from. Like how do systems change? And what I noticed was that beneath everybody's imagination was what I call the Darwinian attitude, which is not Darwin's way of understanding evolution. It's how it's kind of been revised and rescripted in our world today. And that is based on complex adaptive systems thinking. So you see people trying to rise to the challenge, becoming systemic thinkers, really devoting their lives to complexity thinking. And yet it seems to be still part of the problem. So then what's underneath complexity thinking is this Darwinian attitude based on complex adaptive systems thinking. Now, I'm going to parallel that with the fact that everything I'm telling you, it sounds like it's just an intellectual exercise. But for example, I started thinking about complex potential states way back in 2012, when after the recession, I was running a very large landscape design build company. And after the recession, we shrunk. My job was to get us back so we weren't losing money. And then I left the company because we had to start over doing little jobs, and this was not interesting to me anymore. But I kind of had a panic attack because after all those years of being this big systems thinker, I was the operation manager and I did all the job costing and contracting. All of a sudden I'm here. We just bought this farm and we have no income. My husband was in the same industry. And I was in this very unusual state. I would binge watch Mad Men on my Amazon Kindle because, and I knew why. It was because this thing was structured so it needed like this crisis kind of thing coming at me, and I had the horses and the farm and this and that. And then and I would look into the future and I would see nothing. And it wasn't like I had a lot of financial pressures, but I had like zero cash flow because we just bought the farm. I couldn't even do anything about that. But then 8 years later, I was asked to present to Dave Snowden's Whistler retreat. And that's when it hit me, like, I'm going to talk about the Cynefin framework and complexity, but it hit me that what I had just been through was very complex. It was all lived experience, but nothing in what I had experienced to go from zero in my future to being asked to speak to his yearly retreat was complex adaptive systems thinking. I mean, I was under a lot of pressure, but it wasn't coming from anywhere. There was nothing to respond to. And I started to think, well, it just kind of made itself up. This was very fascinating to me, you know? And so I did. That was the first time I presented a theory, a proto theory of complex potential states, because I told his group exactly this story, that what had happened to me didn't seem like, that it followed those rules. And so it was like me, it was a mini crisis in my life. All my friends and family were in the same position. We're all managers at the top of our careers between 55 and 65. And it just, the whole recession rolled through that managerial class because everything was on a reset. So it's very similar to what we would say is maybe a global situation now. I mean, I don't want to make it bigger than it was, but this is where the story of complex potential states theories. And then I garden here. I have 13 acres of gardens. I started to investigate, like when I was in the landscape design build, we worked for Oscar de la Renta and Henry Kissinger and Scott Rudins, and we would build these beautiful organic vegetable gardens that look like Versailles. And I worked on a biodynamic farm for like 12 years. And it was very frustrating because I couldn't understand, I liked the theory of organic gardening, but there was so much labor into producing anything. And I thought, maybe this is just an ideology. But when I lost my job, I started farming here. And I'd worked really, really hard those first 2 years. And, you'd get like one tomato and the pests would come. But then I got kind of busy or distracted, and I'd go in the back paddock and see in this wet, mucky manure pile, there were cherry tomatoes growing. And I'm like, what? Everything I've ever learned was you take the cherry tomatoes, you use nice 2-year-old compost so it's not funky, and you prune them, you do this so they don't get mold on their leaves. And this was tomatoes with their leaves fallen in fresh, mucky, wet, stinky manure flourishing. And I thought, everything I've ever learned is wrong. Because then I realized, well, the cherry tomatoes leaves weren't molding because they had a biome. All that mucky insects and bacteria was a biome that actually prevented the mold, right? So these two things were happening in my life at the same time, as the intellectual in me is wondering what the hell is going on. So I just want to say this because I started to gain confidence by making decisions in the garden and decisions in my life based upon this hunch I had about that there was a different framework to think about complexity, maybe even only complexity in these times of crisis or a radical change. Now, here's another thing that, I'm all about frame shifting. So a lot of people will say, well, how do we make systems change? We're talking about theories of change, and we work really, really hard. And then I say, well, instead of looking at all that, we're going through some of the most radical changes the world has ever seen. So what can we learn from that? It's not that things aren't changing. It's like they're not changing in the direction we want them to go, but they're changing really fast. So that you see how I'm saying, so there's a lot so instead of ignoring that and trying to make up something from scratch, you can say there's all kinds of change happening. Okay, the system's changing like freaky fast, and maybe not in the direction we want to go, but in that there's a theory of change that actually works. So how can I learn from that? So these are the kinds of things, I'm just trying to perform what the popcorn, it was not the most linear way of going about this, but just all these things were happening at the same time. And then at first, I had the first idea about the complex potential states was more of just a storytelling thing. And then I started to really understand why the Darwinian attitude or complex adaptive systems thinking was problematic. And so, yes, so what happens, so is this okay? Is my speed okay? I kind of got excited.
No, this is honestly perfect. But although there is something that I want to ask, because I wasn't expecting that, right? So having read the essay, my immediate thoughts are, oh, you must have been steeped in all sorts of literature to sort of unravel these intellectual, like I don't know, sort of blockages in order to discover that this way of thinking doesn't work. But really what you're saying is your day-to-day life, just going about your actual lived experience and having some things that are maybe changing rapidly, or maybe things that feel like small mini crises, influences how you're then going on to think about the academic side of your life. And I suppose, like, lots of people, I guess not lots of people will be thinking deeply and also dealing with these crises, but at the same time, lots of people are going through similar episodes on a sort of regular basis, but they're maybe not thinking about it, or they're not looking at it and thinking, well, this is a sign that the way that we maybe think about things isn't as optimal as it ought to be. And something that I've picked out of listening to your podcasts is, I guess, the role of imagination. So when you're having to think outside of consciousness or think in a different way, fundamentally, you have to step outside of maybe traditional, rational, moral frameworks and whatnot and use your imagination. And I'm inferring that maybe somewhere along the lines, you're using your imagination in particular ways to make these assumptions and these assertions. So I'd like to ask, or I don't want to go too far into it in case it takes us away, but I am still interested. What do you think the value of imagination is as well? If I can just throw that in there. Sorry.
Yeah, so this is like one of these, this is one of those advertising breaks in between. No, it's a great question. We have to be careful with imagination because, Whitehead said something like, imagination is like the plane that takes flight, but you also have to land. And so for me, I'm not I've always read philosophy, but I didn't have, and I taught a master's course, but I'm not like an academic in the sense that I experience life and then I go and read and try to see. It's like having a conversation. I've been always hands-on, a farmer and a landscaper. And so I think the imagination is essential, but it has to partner with the real world. And so there's a lot of people who are really smart, and they're doing like synoptic integration of a lot of theories. But that's like looking at theories and building it out, and then making a theory about a theory. And this is useful for people like me, because then I'll read their works and I start to see what is useful and what is not. But I don't think you can solve the problem there. It's more of a collaboration. You need people then who are trying to solve problems in the real world. And I know one of you mentioned animal nature. And the thing is, because we're trapped in this way of seeing in the human world, it's much better to take these kinds of ideas and try to solve them in the natural world, and then use them as powerful naturalistic theories. Say nature works like this. Because if you try first to work them out in the human world is so fundamentally operating under this malware that you don't get like a control, when you do an experiment. Nature doesn't have false premises. It's not trying to over strategize you. It's not trying to think of what you're saying and strategize. So the best way to do it is with natural systems, like natural ecologies, to use models from natural ecologies. Because once you're using models from like the financial system, which is a complex system, you can do it, but you have to like already have a very strong idea of how to think outside it, because it's been captured by this ideology, right? So I find that, so the imagination has to be coupled to real world problems. And if those complex systems you're working with can be more natural and less human, then you have a harder constraint. You're actually looking for more fundamental laws of complex systems rather than something that's humanly manufactured. So just ideation doesn't work unless it's helpful for somebody else. Like people who are doing ideation is helpful to me, but that's just something I take with me along the way. So complex adaptive systems, maybe we should articulate why it's a problem and why it's so hard to get out of. So what do we mean by complex adaptive systems thinking? Darwin said that you have populations within a species, and there's mutations in those populations. And so maybe within this population, these two brothers and a sister from their mother gets a gene that some bacteria in the water doesn't bother them. And that these are silent potentials because nothing's happening. And then all of a sudden you get some weird heat wave, mosquitoes come into your territory, the water gets the bacteria and these people die, and this little family is doing fine. They didn't adapt to any evolutionary pressure. They didn't. So we use this term, there's the environment created evolutionary pressure and they adapted to it. So this is a way of thinking about that. But when you actually look at it, that didn't happen at all. Darwin would have never said that. So at a certain point, we started using this language. I did not research that. It'd be kind of interesting historically, where we started to say, okay, this population is, and then this population comes in, and these people have to adapt to these people, and then all of a sudden the environment gets hot. Now we have got to adapt to the climate. Now the environment itself is adaptive pressure. So the organisms, people have to adapt to each other, nations have to adapt to each other. Now the environment is a player. We have to adapt to the environment. And you start to see that something weird is going on. Everything is adapting to everything else, as if that's all any organism ever does. Now, the reason why we believe that as humans is that's how the financial system works, and that's how we think of competition in organizations, right? So if I see you are making, this is changing, by the way, people don't do patents, like Elon Musk doesn't do patents, there's other reasons. But if I see you, when I was working in the landscape company, we had quite a large retail center. And because of the housing boom and people were buying land in this rural area, then this little garden center startup happened down the street. And the owners got really nervous. I'm like, don't pay attention to them. Like the whole point, we just do what we want to do and the way we do it for the customers that we have. But you see, people start to see, I got to adapt to this pressure. I got to adapt to the market change. I have to adapt to this. I have to adapt to that. When I was doing consulting on open participatory organizations, I would tell the managers, don't try to strategize your people. They're smart too, because if you strategize them, they're going to strategize you, on and on and on and on. And so I started to see that underneath all these these protocols for actions, was this one single monolithic idea of how systems and systems change works. And so, so for example, and then you could see this, for example, once you start to think this way, you have pests, you use pesticides. Now, again, the pests that come back next year that are resistant to the pesticides, they're not adapting to your pressure. But then you think, oh, now I got to create more. So this framework makes you think, oh, now I have to create more pesticides and antibiotics and viruses and nuclear arms and nuclear arms defense. And these cycles, and so you notice what happens in a kind of a feed loop like this, everything, complexity will escalate. And so I saw the driver of escalating complexity and X risk as really, I mean, there's two others, but this one was, I saw it as being probably the biggest one. So did I go out and taught? So for years, I never wrote about it because I said, well, you know, I don't want to be a Debbie Downer and say like, the only thing you're all thinking about is ruining it. And I thought, I have to come up with something to replace it. There has to be some imaginative attractor for people to move toward and do their own experiment and flesh out their own possibilities for thinking in this new way. And that's when I wrote the first side view article. You know, I'm still working on it, and there's, you know, you could start to see in Stuart Kaufman this work. I used Christopher Alexander and The Nature of Order, Simondin, who is, I'm reading two more of his books that I finally found. He's not well known, but he's on the same thing, and certainly Whitehead and the process thinkers. And so, so that's when it got to be more formalized. And I'm working with a group, and we're trying to put it together in a more formal way. But so it's still very young, and just to switch back, and then I'll stop, is so to complete the circle is to shift people's imagination around this thing called complex potential states thinking, and then have them be able to go and notice in where they work, take a chance to think somewhere outside the box, notice the tomatoes on the mucky pile and wonder, like, that potential was always there. Why didn't I see it? You know, to notice that there's seek to metabolize latent potential in the system. So this would be a collaborative, you know, so everybody's can come back and say, oh, I did that, and that was kind of like you were talking about. So that would be where I'm at today.
I might jump in here, Bonnitta. I mean, I certainly the idea of complex potential states, it is intuitively important, I think, and exciting. And it speaks to this sense of being in a kind of time between worlds, to use Stein's language, the sort of liminal space. You've said that, you know, that you're exiting complex adaptive systems thinking. And I kind of initially was like, what? I mean, I've just started exiting complicated, non-linear, non-systemic thinking. So do I have to now retool quickly and now exit complex adaptive systems? And the way you describe complex adaptive systems and the sort of the blind spots therein makes sense. But I was wondering whether I could just ask you to clarify a bit more. You know, when I think of complex adaptive systems, I think of emergence, I think of novelty, I think of self-organization, I think of contingency. That's not the frame I think that you're bringing to it. And I'm particularly curious about this language of epistemic closure. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering whether that might be a way into clarifying, you know, what are the real limitations here?
Yeah. So without a doubt, these new ideas, emergence, self-organization, are pulling away from the Darwinian attitude. And so, in fact, someone just kind of said something like this to me, but you have to be careful that what causes emergence? Is it evolutionary pressure, for example, or does emergence arise from, you know, it's kind of like a push-pull thing. Does it arise because you're responding to the past? See, one of the things about responding to the past is the past overburdens and overdetermines the present. And if that's the case, then you won't get emergence. but is emergence actually have a pull directionality to it? This would be a cosmological question that a lot of people are working with. Stuart Kaufman says that the laws of thermodynamics can't account for the profound diversity and complexity and richness of the cosmos. So there must be another part of the gradient array, another directionality. And so the question is, to what extent is the way you experience complex systems as a push or a threat versus a pull and a possibility? And so I think that a lot of young people, the legacy organization, I was going to say, you're lucky that you just started to learn it, because the legacy organizations and legacy consulting firms, they're really steeped in leveraged conflict and strategy and stuff like that. But I think that we can leap forward with the larger framework that's more amenable to these words like emergence and self-organization. And it's all about what is the pull, what is the, and okay. And so the other reason why it's important in times in between worlds, or what regime shift or transition is, so do you all know the panarchy cycle, something about the panarchy cycle? So in the panarchy cycle, there's niche creation, there's radiation. You get a lot of different ways of making a living. And then some of them, so you got maybe 1,000 new species, and then some of them become more successful, and you only have a handful of species, and then they all capitalize on their niche. And then you have the apex predator kind of thing, where all your capital's in the hands of a few people. All your systems are tightly coupled, so you can't get out of it. In human terms, that means global systems, because we're able to do that. And then if it goes on too long, the bigger it becomes, the harder it falls when it crashes. And according to a panarchy cycle, it has to crash. All speculative markets, for example, have to crash. This is true for the global financial system as it is for these Dow and Bitcoin systems. It's the same with, there is, Donna Haraway said that Buzz Holling, who created the panarchy cycle, thinks that we're exiting the Holocene, and the whole era is back loop dynamics, or back loop realities. And so for me, what does back loop realities mean? It means things go extinct, and you should not be surprised, nor try to stop that. Connections are decoupled to allow space for entirely new things to happen. So when you get into complex potential state systems thinking, you stop trying to save the current system, or shore it up, or try to make society more resilient to what's happening. You start saying, okay, that's happening anyways. Thank God there's enough inertia in the system that it doesn't change from day to night. It's changing fast enough already. But what is there for people when the dust, settles? So this is not even trying to respond to the meta crisis as a crisis. That's work that other people can do. That you need a lot of hospice, you need a lot of this, but what is there when the dust settles? And this is not unusual for people. So for example, it's hard for us to remember, but despite what we know is problematic 200 years later, but to go from like feudalism to a constitutional colonies in the New World is a huge shift. Like there's there's no more king. Like, we're not going to do without a king, and all these systems and all these ways and rituals that we organize ourselves. That was reimagined. And I think for them, it was able to be reimagined because they were on a new land. There's something about being able to start over. If something's cut really fast and something's very brand new, now there's no new places for us to go. So we have to like kind of pretend that we're going to act, be the first movers, just act from as if the dust is already settled, because we can't, and so yes, your instincts and intuition are right, and this is normally this is normal emergence in the human system. But I think I would offer a complex potential state system to really kind of make a disjunction with the past, because I see people like yourselves, they'll go from talking about emergence and have this idea of how things change, and then someone will give them a scenario, and you're right back into being locked in to complex adaptive systems thinking. So let me just give you an example. So there's this great short video called 100,000 Beating Hearts that everyone should watch. And it's a story of white oak pastures. And the guy was actually on Joe Rogan. And he was like, fourth generation farmer, rancher of cows in the South in Georgia. And he waited till his father died, and then he started changing. Like, at first, all he wanted to do is not give his cows antibiotics. They were in feedlots with corn. You use a lot of nitrogen fertilizer, grow a lot of corn, put your animals in feedlots, raise them cheaply, ship them off to factory butchers, and make a profit. So over time, he realized that he didn't use antibiotics, and then he didn't use pesticides. Then the soils came back, and then he integrated sheep and chickens and onto his land, because you could rotate them. And then pretty soon the whole rivers came back, and then the grasslands grew, and the eagles came back. And so my point, but in this process that he was just experimenting with, almost went bankrupt, because he had been living on government subsidies. And then if you're not doing that kind of agriculture, he didn't have his government subsidies. But the whole point here is that the town, there was nobody left living in the town. The town came back, because then he had butchers, and then they had farm markets, and then people really liked what he was doing. So he had tourists coming to see, and then he hired more employees to do sustainable stuff. And now the town is thriving. So he says, I healed the soil, and I rebuilt the town. And he's like, it's directly related. It's not a coincidence. So now, how does this fit into what your question was? Because during that time, and he would say this, everyone was saying, yeah, but if you do this, then you're not going to get your subsidy. If you don't get your subsidy, you're not going to, and it all sounds very logical, because these farmers were systems thinking. And then what happens is a drought. Then you won't get the money from the federal government, and this will happen, and then this will happen, and then that. So this is all very beautiful systems thinking. And in that system, everything they were saying was rationally logic and true. Everything. And so if you slide back, one thing then leads to another logically, and leads to another, and you'll start to feel, oh, I got to control this system. But you've manufactured one kind of system you're working with, versus opening up to another system. And all that, the town was dead. And the guy at White Oak Pastures, he had enough money to buy the old houses and build and improve them, and have his employees rent them. And then there's enough land, so like, you walk into a dead town, and you think, wow, there's a lot of potential here. This is a big It's a huge switch in being able to perceive what's the latent potential in the system already. Yeah, so I don't know if I answered your question, but there's a lot going on.
Sorry, could I just come in here? This has been really interesting, and something that I find really special with what you're doing is how often you're drawing on the natural world and listening to to this podcast, and also reading, for example, your Corona essays. I noticed that this is quite like unique. And in the Corona essays, you also mentioned this idea of digital naturalism. So I was just wondering about how you think this plays into our current world, and especially with this, with climate change that we have to live with every day, and how you think that we can use this to perhaps combat climate change as well.
Yeah, so I'm not an expert on that. I just know that I hear from people who are working in those spaces, the DAO spaces and Web 3.0. They like my work, and I intuit there's something that can flourish if people who are working on digital systems can start thinking in terms of complex potential states or more about the natural world. So now this gets very tricky, because our orientation with technology, it's very scary to think of technology going into the natural world, because it's always been a dominating force whenever we've taken technology into the natural world. So I'm just going to start off with that, because now what I'm going to say, you have to try to imagine that it's not exploitive, because I don't know how to talk about it, because there's so few examples of that. And now, what do I don't mean? I certainly don't mean what Bill Gates is doing, where he's got these huge AI-powered chicken buildings that move so they can rotate the chickens down, up and down the field, and call that free-range chicken. I don't mean the mass scale coordination of life by AI. I don't mean so now they have these farms where the AI moves the little robots, and the robots put spot insecticide, so it's not hugely. So this all sounds like green, and I don't mean that. And in fact, there's a problem with that. And one of the problems with that is when you work with living systems, as I've done for many, many years, there are people who will always kill their plants because they always water it the same amount on the same day every week, and it kills their plants. I started in landscape. I started with a woman. We built this big company in New York called doing indoor and outdoor plantscape. That was a time when you'd have these big, huge gardens in the lobbies in New York City. And one of the things that we had to teach people who went and took care of the plants is exactly, don't do that. You need to kind of overwater for a while and then give it a little drought, and then maybe go, even keel for a while, and then it has to cycle through these things. It's the same with if you have horses and they're out in pastures, they get worms. So you have to worm them with ivermectin. Ivermectin, very, very controversial drug. Ivermectin was discovered, not manufactured, by a Japanese farmer who noticed that his animals that were eating dirt over here didn't have worms. So got a bad name. I just want to say that. But so the animal feed companies came out like 20 years ago, and they said, oh, buy our animal feed. We have a little bit of pest of wormicide in it. So every time you're feeding your animal, you give them a little bit, so you don't have to warm them 3 times a year or once a month. But people now only do it twice a year. And I said, that's going to kill. I told my friends, that's going to kill your horse, because a little bit of poison, it's not actually poisonous, but a little bit of intervention always will kill a system. It will kill a system. And this whole orientation of AI to micro and nano manipulate life is death. I'm telling you right now, this is a surefire way to kill your system. So I don't mean that when I mean digital naturalism. I don't mean miniaturizing instead of huge huge machines, miniaturizing the machines so they're closer to the life force. I don't mean that at all. So having said that, what is an example of technology for digital naturalism? There is a study out there, I think it's a video, where people studied prairie dog chirps. And with digital surveillance, with watching their behaviors and listening to their chirps and having an AI, they discovered that they have very complex language. It's just that their chirps go so fast we can't hear, that there's phonemes in there or little words. And through this, then they understood that the behaviors they were watching and the way they were talking, they understood that the landscape, they were talking to other species also. So I think one of the biggest things about digital naturalism is, if we think of us and our animals, if you have horses, if you have dogs, dogs pretty much can figure out quite a lot of human words. We have parrots that can figure out human words. The animal kingdom's really able animals to come very, very close into our lives. But very few people, when they come to my horse workshops, have any idea of how to enter into the horse's perspective. They've all moved here. So this is something we're very, very dumb at. We don't know how to talk to the animals or the plants. And I think technology can can translate that for us, because we're good at looking at blips and other kinds of intermediaries. And I think AI could actually be trained, especially now the way we're understanding how it can be trained to look at humans' language. It can be trained to listen in a way that we're no longer able to listen. And I think that there's a whole entirely new entryway into us understanding ourselves and our place on this planet by listening to all the other communications that are happening in the natural world. I suspect they would, people probably have this imagination. Yeah, the plants I suspect it's wildly beyond our imagination what's actually going there. And then, of course, I do this imaginative thing and I say, what would they say about us? And I think we're afraid they would say, oh, you're destroying everything. And perhaps they would reflect something about us that is essential to their lives and that we could understand better. And then, we wouldn't be so deep inside. A lot of us, especially people of your generation, we're not very proud to be humans, are we? And so for my hope is that in what I experience myself in the natural world is that there's a greater intimacy that can happen that would then really, much more than what I'm doing on paper, transform our understanding of the world and the universe and our place in it. So yeah, it's a great question. I hope I answered what you were saying. But I don't know how I'm just trying to, I'm out of that generation and I'm trying to give people who those skills and that technology is native to them. There's a huge amounts of careers there. Why work on, like, speculative markets? Like, all the DAOs, all they're doing is just creating speculative markets. I think there's cool stuff that could be done.
Bonnitta, it's been really, fascinating listening to the span of what we've gone through. I don't know whether we thought we'd be talking about what we were talking about at the start, and I love how it's just kind of grown organically. I was thinking about Ollie talking about imagination, and us talking about that sensation of trying to find the potential within the latent potential, and it feels really invigorating. I'm trying to figure out whether it's trying to imagine, after the dust has settled, whether it's like an overlay onto our reality, or whether we're actually stripping things away to see what's underneath it, and it might be a bit of both. But I'm also aware that you've talked a lot about wisdom, and wisdom takes time, and I think you said that it took you 20 years to figure out about horses. For people listening who feel really invigorated and really overwhelmed with imagination about, the dust has settled, and how can we imagine that, and how can we think about that? What would you say to them of how they can do that in their daily life? And also, as a kind of, I don't know if this would link, I was really overwhelmed by your idea of causal wildness. And I don't know if you could maybe tie that in to the individual's experience of going on this kind of journey of almost imagining the world as the dust has settled, and how do I look at my life, and how do I walk around on the streets with this awareness?
Yeah, well, that's a question that's a huge invitation, putting those together. So the first part, I'm going to break it down into pieces, which I think you asked it in a much more beautiful kind of way, but to control it. This is something I've thought about. It is the case that I've had the ability to work with natural systems for a long, long time, and keep asking these questions. And in my circles, this is something that there's several people that are like that. But then we ask the question, like, obviously you can't expect 8 billion or 5 billion people to spend 45, 55, 60 years trying to get back into this kind of slower pace. The world's not going like that. And so the question is there something that I as a human can do when I meet you that creates the same relations that happens when I look at my tomato plants? Like, can I be less of a human entering your system and more of a horse? And we can, I don't get into that whole horse journey, but so is it possible for people to act like nature in consort with other people so that people are encountering that experience? Does that make sense? Like, yeah. So this is a question that doesn't have an answer. It's good for like collective conversation over time as you go and you and so I think that is a reality that would have to be achieved in order for more people to encounter these kinds of situations. I happen to think this is something is more of a story, but I happen to think this is why we want to go to Mars. And why do you want to terraform Mars when you can terraform here? Because there's something in the spirit that wants to start over, that wants this kind of confrontation with raw nature. It's too easy for people to climb Everest now, even though people die. There's something in the imagination that's like this. So So that's an interesting question, and I actually do workshops where I try to reproduce the kinds of experiences, physical experiences, with people that that could kind of lead to this. And I would say that's associated with causal wildness. Like, how do people, uh, um, you know, you go for a walk in nature. Nature is the most complex thing, but you don't feel like, when you, Arnie Nass said this, nature is the most complex thing in the world, but when you walk into nature, primeval forest, you don't feel like pressure. You feel something else, right? So can we be like that for other people? Because in that is the causal structure of life. That is the causal manifold of life. I have geeky ways to say it, but I'm not going to get into that. But it's just more of an aspirational thing. So it all has to do with changing your dispositional state. I talk about bodies in space. When two dogs come to the park, it changes the dynamic. I mean, they're always like excited. When a person, if you're in a meeting and another person comes in, it changes the constellation. And so bodies are like planetary bodies. We distort space. Okay, so then the question is, how do you want your body to distort space? Can I make my body that kind of body? I was giving a workshop once, and I was also raising this orphan deer. And he was at the point where he'd go away during the day and come back. And we were all sitting in a circle, and we're all like, the world's going to hell. And this little, like, 2-week-old deer walks in, and he looks at us, and his body completely transformed the space. And so what is that? Like, what is that power? What is that causal power? So you can start to relate to your body as that. So that, I would say, is the body has latent potential to transform space. Why is that? Like, that's just another thing you can think about, and that I do workshops on. And so you're working with some fundamental causal levers of the human condition, which gives you much more, there's much more leverage when you're working with those things than when you're trying to work with hyper objects, let's say. So that would be causal wildness. And I think I answered both questions. So yes, not everybody can go and spend 50 years being so focused, but everyone will spend 50 years with other people. And could there be enough other people? And can we change people to asking questions, these kind of intimate questions about the human system? So in that sense, it took me 50 years to figure out what another human is. You could have the same encounter, but if you had more people walking around as nature and not so much this mental social anxiety strategizing, then maybe a few people could make a big difference. And then something like complex potential states theory helps you use language while you're doing that to give people reasons to believe, give the intellect some fuel to create confidence that this is part of it too.
And keep in mind, I suppose, that we're a podcast on global governance futures.
Yeah, let's do it.
We're certainly not like these kinds of conversations are really conversations which inspire us. And we had Jonathan Keats on before, who's this kind of iconoclastic author, installation artist, very much working in the spirit of Buckminster Fuller, within the spirit of Goethean science.
Oh yes, that's great.
These ideas of abduction and so on, which I think is the sandpit that we're playing in here as well. But perhaps with my devil's advocate hat on, I can imagine some people coming into this conversation and sort of thinking, well, this all sounds very good, but we're in a world which is kind of locked into nuclear weapons mutually assured destruction doctrine, potential for conflict escalation, very serious conflict right now out there in the Middle East. Some people might respond and say, look, these ideas of complex potential states, these systemic ideas, this sort of new systems theory itself is problematic because it overestimates the possibilities for voluntary change out in the world, that there are these kinds of overbearing kind of structural constraints which determine outcomes. And, we're not taking power seriously enough. We're not taking interests seriously enough. And perhaps we're not taking sort of overshoots and the hard limits seriously enough. I think of Philip K. Dick's phrase, reality is that which, when you stop believing in it, doesn't go away. So how do we begin to engage in a dialogue with that community?
So the most valuable thing I can say, there's other things I could point to that other people have said. So let me try to say something that I can contribute. And this is another switch that I'm writing about, and that is, so this is not directly related to complex potential states thinking, but it's the metaphysic behind it, which is process relational metaphysics. You might have heard me talk to Greg Enriquez recently on his U-Talk. So we want to make the distinction between justice, ethics, and morals. And I think this is kind of a little bit that would be more involved in governance. And we could look at this in terms of Black Lives Matter and Israel and Gaza. Lightly, because what I'm going to say is just to illustrate the distinction, not to solve those huge problems. So in process relational philosophy, you have external interactions. So we are speaking. This is an external interaction, even though it's digital. But the principle, the fundamental universal principle, is for every external interaction you have, the word is ingress. A part of your subjectivity is ingressing into me. Now, at the concrete level is when the fox interacts with the rabbit and eats them, that's literally ingression, right? At the it's like metabolizing. Now, this cannot not happen, and at the linguistic representational level, it's happening also. So now it's very important that if I'm in conflict with you, you are still ingressing into me. If I'm pushing you away, you are still ingressing into me, and I start to have conflict in myself. It's not possible for this to not happen. It can be tiny little thing. I'm not saying, so it doesn't make much difference. Okay, so this is a very important thing to understand. Governments have slowly evolved to only think of external interactions, to do justice. So this is something we need to do. Justice is the reparation, remuneration, recompensation of external actions. If you steal $3,000 to me, I go to court, I want justice. What do I want? $3,000 back. So justice is the reparation between competing external interactions. Right. So that's the simple. Of people who are not in the same context, right? Because you want justice between, you wanted the $3,000, I think it's mine, blah, blah, blah. Okay. Ethics, so ethics has to do with values. And the thing about values is they're not, they're incommensurable. You can't adjudicate them. So with justice, you can say, okay, this is $3,000, this $3,000, we want it back. With values, they're incommensurable. So It's good that the fox catches the rabbit so she can go home and feed her babies. It's good for the rabbit to get away so she can go home and feed her babies. Hartshorne said at the level of animals, these are all goods, but they're incommensurable. At the levels of humans, this is also true. And it preserves more potential and a wider complexity in the system. So despite what the postmodernists want to say, values are incommensurable. And ethics is the process, it's an ongoing process, it never ends because you can't adjudicate them, of communicating with people who share your context. So what's ethical as a plumber is different than what's ethical between a doctor and their client, right? So you should not engage in the language of ethics with and values with Israel and Gaza because they don't have a shared context. And justice will only get you tit for tat. Somehow in the core of how much destruction should Israel do to make up for what Gaza does. They're only at the level of justice. Okay. Just to finish the ethics one, in values are not all goods in all situations. So here's a value, right? A value is that I don't want to steal. But if I could steal to save someone's life, then that's not a good, that's no longer a good. So not all values are not goods in all contexts. Now we have morality. Morality has to do with the good, right? The good in this context, always. Not to say, this is my values. I don't care what the context is. And the good has to deal with the internal relations between you and the other. So the good is always increasing the potential for the good in everyone involved. So if you give too much, then you might have decreased the potential for the good in you. If you give too much to the homeless person, and maybe you increase good in him, but if you're decreasing your own capacity to do the good in you, you have to also manage that. So it's in the whole system itself, right? So when Black Lives Matters runs into a suburban cafe and shames white people for what is truly an atrocity, that's a just act, but it's not moral because you're decreasing the potential for the good across the society. So this is something people like Martin Luther King knew. So first of all, we have to ask ourselves, what is the purview of governance? Is it justice, ethics, or morality? And these are very confused in our society today. And now there's all kinds of ways and you can think of what to do with that. But you don't want people confusing values which are incommensurable in the court of justice. But you don't want, what's almost always now neglected is the moral good, the internal relations of the people. And unfortunately, the reason why is because this has been the purview of religion, and religion became fundamentalist across all the institutions for a long time. And so we have the ability, so you don't want to have a state that's overseen by religious people as we understand them today. I'm not saying that. But we need to be able to dissect these three facets of the human condition and understand what is the appropriate, you understand the problem across these three domains and try to work more toward the establishment of the good, to kind of understand justice has a role, but ethics is interesting, but values are not, they're not the language of morality. And so that's, I didn't solve any of your problems, I know, but I think that's where we go in my work with looking at these very large scale questions. And I hope I didn't ruffle any of your or trigger any of your audience by my simplistic examples. I used these two examples merely to highlight this one distinction, not to solve or frame the entire problem.
We are unfortunately getting toward the end of our time, even though that had just entered something that was really interesting and could have gone on for a much longer amount of time.
We always end at the beginning in these things. It's a kind of thing that I do.
But to finish up, something that really did stick out of that last little bit that you mentioned is this idea that we have potential for good. And for all of the different ways that you can interpret the challenges that go on around the world, I think there is a shared sense in varying degrees that we do have a responsibility to address these challenges or to try and think differently about these challenges. And I suppose I'd like to ask, in light of that, what sort of advice can you give to younger people who are maybe trying to make sense of all of these different issues that can help them maintain that potential for good that they do have within themselves?
Yeah, I'd like to do it by telling a story. I'm going to tell a story in two ways, and then I'll wrap it up as advice. So you can imagine this man. It was actually a movie I saw, but he's rock climbing with his young son and his even younger daughter. So maybe the son is like 12 years old and his daughter is 9, or maybe a little older, 14 and 12 or something like that. The daughter's at the top, then the son's in the middle, and the father's and they're rock climbing where you have these pitons, the metal and with gear. And the mountain slips or something, and the father is dangling at the end, and it's very dramatic, and the rope is going to pull out one of the metal things, and the daughter's up top freaking out, and the son is trying to pull the father up, and he just can't. And the father and the son, they lock eyes, and the father's saying, "Cut the rope, just cut the rope," meaning cut the father off. And everybody recognizes this is the right thing to do, right? Because otherwise they're all going to die. And it's also in the order of things, because the adult should sacrifice himself. Okay, so now let's reimagine the situation, get rid of the girl at top, and it's just the father and the son, and you have the same thing. And now the son is like 14 or 15. And he's trying to pull, and the father's locking eyes with the son. He says, "Cut the rope." And as he's just saying, "God damn it, just cut the rope," he sees something in his son's eyes, and he realizes that his son is at the age where he'll never forgive himself. And he says, okay, this is what we're going to do. Because he sees his son in a new context. Like all of a sudden, it shifts. Whether they both die or not now, it's still, now this is the right thing to do. Can you feel why? Can you feel why? That's the level of relationship required of young people with their peers and their parents today. That's really what is required. Everything else is the discursive stuff we have to do, but this is the homework. Adults looking at the children, and the children looking at adults, and peers to peer. We need to watch each other grow.
That was wonderful, Bonnitta. Really wonderful. I suppose, we're sort of grasping towards some kind of language to create a holding space where we can cultivate and nourish that kind of real connection, which you so eloquently were able to inspire through a story. And I suppose in the old days, it might have been within a communal spiritual setting where we know the stakes are high, we know that sort of our own fate is entwined with the fate of another. And I suppose we're trying to find our way back to that, but it's going to be a way back to somewhere entirely new.
Yeah. And notice you're doing some of that already, but now notice that you and your group are. I'm sure you're doing some of that already, but pay more attention to it and make it more explicit, right? I'm sure that's happening. I can feel that in your group. So yeah, to have answered that question, like with these meta abstract, I could do that. I'll do that on paper. Maybe someone will read it someday. But that's really what we're trying to express.
Well, I think that's a wonderful note to end on. Thank you so much, Bonnitta, for your time. It's been a journey. It's been a wonderful journey. So thank you.
Well, thank you. That little question you all answered before, this was really, that one little seed really helped me journey with you in a spontaneous way. That was wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thanks for tuning in to Imperfect Utopias or Bust, Global Governance Futures. If you liked this content, please do leave us a comment and subscribe. If you're new to the show and you want to get a list of our favorite books, other resources, listen to past shows, and to join our community, go to ucl.ac.uk/global-governance.